keep in mind, we've been there too. It may not have been in the winter, but the Northeast blackout of 2003, it started right here in Northeast Ohio. And while the impacts are far-reaching, no two blackouts are the same. Electricity is everything. It runs our homes, our businesses, our phones, our cars. At the simple flip of a switch or the push of a button, our modern lives run on the critical infrastructure known as the power grid. Moving at about 1,000 miles per second, electricity moves from power plants through high voltage transmission lines that feed a network of stations that then distribute it to individual customers. Operators in control rooms across the country are constantly monitoring the flow to ensure it stays balanced. If there's a service interruption or a fault, an operator can redirect power around that problem area quickly to keep the system online. The grid is more than just interconnected power lines. The grid is interconnected power companies, states, and even countries that buy and sell electricity within the grid's market. The contiguous United States relies on 3 electrical system grids. The electricity that is produced, bought, and sold in the grid stays in the grid, and outside electricity can't be brought in. This is why Texas is in such a tough spot right now, because about 75% of the state is in a relatively small grid known as ERCOT. The extreme cold froze up as much as 50% of their electrical production, actually icing up natural gas and coal-fired power plants as well as wind turbines. Even the solar panels were covered in snow, and a nuclear power plant was taken offline to avoid overload. The slump in power generation, while it was so cold, meant the supply of power couldn't meet the demand, and the grid's market collapsed. So the lights went out in Texas for millions.
It was a hot day.
That's the way many of us remember August 14th, 2003.
The demand for electricity was high, so the grid was stressed.
Temperatures across Northeast Ohio surged into the upper 80s, and a little after 3 o'clock on that hot Cleveland afternoon, a 345,000-volt transmission wire in Eastlake shorted out when it touched some nearby trees that had grown too close. In less than an hour, 55 million people in 8 states and 1 Canadian province were in the dark. It was an uncontrolled, cascading failure of computer glitches, human error, and institutional mismanagement. In essence, it was nothing like Texas.
So pretty big differences. In one case, it was sort of a problem with transmission. In another case, it was a problem with generation.
But millions of customers are suffering, and billions of dollars will be lost. No matter how they are caused, blackouts create huge problems.
This type of event occurs every 10 to 20 to 30 years, depending on where we're talking about the grid. And there's usually a lot of quick changes that occur, but not long-term changes. For the average household consumer, no, there's nothing that they can do. And even if all of them got together right now and said, we want this to never happen again, they lobby the regulators and the changes get made in record speed, it would still be 2 to 5 years before any upgrades would actually hit the grid.
And so our simple flip of the switch is anything but simple. I tell you, I learned so much doing this research for this story. I took a lot of the power grid for granted.
We do.
And that blackout of 2003 here in Cleveland, that's one of those events, no matter who you mention it to, everybody knows where they were when the lights went out. And, it was such a huge deal. 55 million people without power in the middle of the summer. There was a huge investigation that happened. Jeff Daigle, that I interviewed there, was one of the leaders in the investigation and getting data acquisition. And the interesting thing is, once that was over with, the Energy Reliability Act was passed in 2005 to try and hold utilities accountable for holding up the market and the grid. So certainly that has changed a lot of things. I guarantee you the Deep South, they're going to see a lot of things changing too, but it takes a long time for those changes to happen.
Yeah, and from time to time you hear how vulnerable the grid is to a cyber attack. I mean, it really makes you kind of stay up at night if you think about it, because we are so reliant on electricity for everything we do. That's a game changer.